You feel things others don't. You sense the unspoken tension in every room. You know when someone is lying before they finish their sentence. And Carl Jung confirmed this isn't sensitivity. It's a dormant spiritual ability most empaths suppress because they're terrified of what happens when they stop hiding and start using it. Today, I'm revealing the shocking transformations that occur when an empath flips the switch from receiver to transmitter, from victim to force of nature, from absorbing everyone's darkness to directing your own light with surgical precision. This is what Jung discovered about empaths who actually use their spiritual abilities, and it terrified him. But before we dive into the transformations themselves, you need to understand why Jung called this discovery dangerous in the first place. Because what he observed in his clinical practice wasn't just interesting psychology, it was a fundamental shift in how consciousness operates. And once you trigger this shift, there's no going back to comfortable unconsciousness. Let's start with the uncomfortable truth Jung documented across decades of clinical work. Empathy isn't just an emotion, it's a perception function, a form of intuition so advanced that it operates like spiritual technology. You're not just feeling someone's sadness, you're accessing data streams most humans can't detect. Micro-expressions, energy shifts, unconscious patterns, the hidden architecture of human psychology laid bare before your awareness. Modern neuroscience has finally caught up to what Jung intuited a century ago. Research on mirror neurons shows that some people's brains process social and emotional information at dramatically higher rates than the general population. Your neural networks are literally wired to perceive what others miss. You're not imagining your abilities. Your brain is built differently. But here's the problem. Society taught you to doubt this gift. Every time you voiced what you saw, people called you too sensitive, too emotional, too much. So you learned to suppress the very ability that makes you extraordinary. You became a receiver, passively absorbing everyone's psychological debris, a human sponge soaking up trauma, lies, and manipulation while apologizing for your existence. And this is where most empaths stay trapped, in what Jung called the victim phase, where your greatest gift becomes your deepest wound, where you feel everything but do nothing, where you're drowning in everyone else's unconscious content while your own consciousness remains dormant. Jung studied what happens when empaths stop apologizing, when they stop absorbing and start directing, when they transform from victim to what he called the differentiated intuitive. And the changes are so profound, so powerful, that they fundamentally alter reality itself. This isn't metaphor. This is documented psychological transformation that changes how you interact with the fabric of existence. So what exactly happens when you flip the switch, when you move from passive receiver to active transmitter? Let me walk you through each stage of transformation, because understanding the map helps you navigate the territory. The first transformation Jung documented is what I call the see-through effect. When you actually use your empathic abilities consciously, social masks don't just fade, they dissolve completely. You don't just sense that someone is sad, you see the specific childhood wound causing their depression, the exact moment their father's criticism embedded itself in their psyche, the precise defense mechanism they constructed to avoid feeling abandoned. Consider a case profile that demonstrates this principle. We see this dynamic clearly in the story of a woman who walks into her workplace after beginning to consciously use her abilities. Her colleague is smiling and making jokes. To everyone else, he seems fine, happy even. But when she tunes into her differentiated intuition, she sees through the performance. She perceives the grinding anxiety beneath his cheerful mask. She senses the financial crisis he's hiding from his wife. She feels the desperation he won't voice to anyone. Not because she's psychic, because she's paying attention at a level most humans never reach. This is Jung's concept of intuition as a perception function, It's not magical thinking. It's advanced pattern recognition. Your brain processes thousands of microsignals simultaneously. Facial muscle tension, voice modulation, breathing patterns, body language, energy signatures. You're reading the complete psychological text while others see only the cover. The colleague's smile doesn't reach his eyes. His jokes have a manic quality. His laughter comes half a second too late. His shoulders carry invisible weight. These aren't mystical perceptions. They're data points. Your differentiated intuition synthesizes into accurate conclusions about his internal state. But here's where it gets dangerous. When you start using this ability, you can't unsee what you're perceiving. The cheerful colleague's mask stays dissolved. Your mother's manipulation tactics become transparent. Your partner's emotional walls stand out like neon signs. Your friend's self-deception becomes painfully obvious. You're seeing reality with such clarity that going back to comfortable delusions becomes impossible. This creates what Jung called the loneliness of consciousness, because now you're watching people play games they don't know they're playing. You're seeing defenses they don't know they've constructed. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The alchemist's path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. You're perceiving wounds they've spent lifetimes avoiding, and you can't pretend anymore. You can't participate in the collective agreement to ignore what's actually happening beneath the surface. Jung called this the curse of consciousness. Once you wake up to your perceptive abilities, you can't fall back asleep. You're awake in a world of sleepwalkers, and that awakening changes everything about how you move through life. Let me be clear about what this stage feels like. It's disorienting, isolating, sometimes overwhelming. You'll sit in conversations where people discuss surface-level topics while you're perceiving the psychological earthquakes happening underneath their words. You'll watch relationships implode and know exactly why, months before the people involved figure it out. You'll see patterns people are doomed to repeat until they gain consciousness. And nobody wants to hear what you're seeing, because unconscious people are invested in staying unconscious. Your clarity threatens their carefully constructed defenses, so they'll call you negative, judgmental, too intense. They'll make you wrong for seeing clearly, rather than face what you're reflecting back to them. This is the price of the see-through effect. You gain extraordinary perception, but lose the comfort of shared delusion. Jung observed that this stage is where many empaths break. They can't handle being awake while everyone around them sleeps. They can't bear the isolation that comes with clarity. So they either shut down their abilities completely, or they fall into the second trap, which brings us to the next transformation. The second transformation is even more disturbing. Jung discovered that when empaths consciously use their abilities, something remarkable happens. The energy flow reverses. Instead of absorbing everyone's emotional chaos, you start influencing the psychological atmosphere itself. You become what Jung called the integrated empath, a transmitter rather than a receiver. Here's how this manifests in practice. You walk into a room where people are lying, manipulating, playing unconscious games. Before your transformation, you would have absorbed all that toxic energy, felt sick, needed to escape, spent 3 days recovering from one dinner party. But when you're operating as a conscious transmitter, your presence alone forces truth to surface. Liars start stuttering mid-sentence. Manipulators feel inexplicably uncomfortable and make excuses to leave. People playing games suddenly can't maintain their facades. The person who was about to lie finds themselves telling the truth instead. The couple pretending everything is fine starts bickering. The group dynamic built on unspoken agreements begins to crack. This isn't you doing anything aggressive. You're not calling people out or confronting them. It's the natural effect of integrated consciousness meeting unconscious behavior. Your clarity creates a field that reflects people's shadows back to them. They feel exposed, not because you're judging them, but because your presence won't participate in their delusions. Let's explore a composite example based on patterns Jung observed. An empath enters a family gathering. Before her transformation, she would have absorbed everyone's dysfunction, felt responsible for managing everyone's emotions, left exhausted and depleted. But now, operating as a conscious transmitter, something different happens. Her aunt, who usually dominates conversations with subtle manipulation, finds she can't gain traction. Her uncle, who typically makes passive-aggressive comments disguised as jokes, suddenly feels his own hostility and goes quiet. Her mother, who orchestrates family drama, discovers nobody is taking the bait. The empath hasn't said anything confrontational. She's simply present, grounded in her own consciousness, refusing to absorb or enable unconscious behavior. And that refusal creates a vacuum where truth starts emerging naturally. Jung identified this as the magician archetype activating within the individuated empath. You gain the ability to influence psychological reality through pure presence, not through force or manipulation, but through the transformative power of conscious awareness meeting unconscious content. You become a living mirror that people can't avoid looking into. But this power comes with profound responsibility, because once you activate this transmission capability, you can't pretend to be powerless anymore. You can't play victim when you're walking around with the psychological equivalent of a lightsaber. Every interaction becomes a choice: absorb or direct, enable or illuminate, participate in unconscious games, or stand as a beacon of uncomfortable truth. And here's what Jung found most disturbing about this stage. People will start avoiding you. Not everyone. The conscious ones will seek you out, but unconscious people will instinctively stay away. They won't be able to articulate why. They'll just know that being around you makes them uncomfortable, makes them see things about themselves they're not ready to see. Your presence becomes a litmus test. It sorts people into those ready for consciousness and those still invested in their defenses. This isn't a bug, it's a feature, but it intensifies the isolation that began in the first stage. The third transformation Jung documented involves what he called meaningful coincidences. When you're using your empathic abilities consciously, the barrier between your internal world and external reality starts thinning. Synchronicities multiply. You think of someone and they call 5 minutes later. You need specific information, and it appears in the next conversation you have. You wonder about a problem, and the solution presents itself through a book that falls off a shelf. You consider a career change and receive an unexpected job offer in that exact field. This isn't magic or manifestation mythology. It's what happens when your unconscious mind connects to what Jung termed the collective unconscious, that vast psychological substrate we all share. When your awareness becomes differentiated enough, you start perceiving patterns in this collective field. Your intuition taps into information streams beyond your individual consciousness. Let me illustrate this with a narrative that captures the phenomenon. An empath reaches a point in her journey where she stops doubting her perceptions. She trusts her intuitive hits completely. She follows the subtle pulls and nudges her unconscious sends her. Within weeks, her life transforms. She walks into a coffee shop and sits next to someone who becomes a crucial business partner. She picks up a book randomly and finds the exact concept she needed for a problem she'd been struggling with. She thinks about an old friend, and that friend emails her the same day with an opportunity perfectly aligned with her current goals. It's as if reality itself is responding to her conscious intentionality, and in a sense, it is Jung studied this phenomenon extensively. He realized that when consciousness reaches a certain level of integration, the individual becomes a co-creator with the collective unconscious, not through wishful thinking or positive affirmations, but through genuine psychological alignment. Your conscious intentions harmonize with unconscious patterns, creating what appears to be miraculous timing, but is actually consciousness operating at its full capacity. This is where empaths who use their abilities discover something extraordinary. You're not separate from reality, observing it from the outside. You're embedded in reality, influencing it through the quality of your consciousness. Your perceptions don't just receive information, they participate in shaping what information becomes available to receive. Think of it like tuning a radio. Before your transformation, you were stuck on static-filled stations, picking up everyone's noise. Now you've learned to tune the dial precisely. You're accessing clear signals from the collective field. Information that was always there, but you couldn't perceive, becomes available. Connections that were always possible, but you couldn't see, become obvious. Jung called this participation mystique in its highest form. Not the unconscious merger with collective content that drowns your individuality, but the conscious dance with collective patterns that enhances your effectiveness in the world. But Jung issued a stark warning about this power. And this brings us to the fourth transformation, the one he found most dangerous, the one that destroys awakened empaths more reliably than any external attack. Jung called it the mana personality, inflation, the risk that comes when you discover you have these extraordinary abilities. Because once you realize you can see through people, influence rooms, and bend reality through synchronicities, a tempting delusion whispers in your mind. Maybe you're special. Maybe you're enlightened. Maybe you're chosen. Maybe you're a god walking among unconscious mortals who just don't understand how evolved you've become. This is the trap that destroys awakened empaths, not the abilities themselves, but identifying with those abilities, believing you're superior because you can see what others can't. Jung watched patients fall into this inflation repeatedly. They would integrate their empathic gifts, discover their power, and then become possessed by the very archetype they were meant to serve. Consider this narrative illustration of the dynamic. We see this pattern clearly in the story of an empath who spends years being trampled, ignored, manipulated. Finally, she awakens to her abilities. Suddenly, she sees everyone's games, predicts their behaviors, influences outcomes. The power is intoxicating after years of powerlessness, and slowly, subtly, she starts seeing herself as above others, more conscious, more evolved. She stops relating to normal human messiness because she's transcended it. She looks at unconscious people with barely concealed contempt. She becomes isolated, not because others reject her, but because she's rejected her own humanity. She starts speaking in absolutes. She knows what others need even when they don't ask. She offers unsolicited insights, disguised as concern. She believes her perceptions are always accurate because she's awakened. She surrounds herself only with people who validate her specialness. She interprets any criticism as others' inability to handle her consciousness. Jung recognized this pattern as spiritual bypassing, wrapped in psychological language, using your superior perception to avoid your own shadow, seeing everyone else's unconscious content while remaining blind to your own inflation. It's the most sophisticated form of ego defense because it masquerades as enlightenment, and here's what makes it truly dangerous. When you're inflated with the mana personality, you lose the very abilities you're so proud of, because genuine empathic perception requires humility, requires acknowledging that you're human, flawed, limited, perpetually learning. The moment you believe you've arrived at some superior consciousness, you've actually regressed into spiritual narcissism. Your perceptions become distorted by your ego investment in being special. You start seeing what confirms your superiority rather than what's actually there. You lose the nuanced sensitivity that made your abilities valuable in the first place. You become a caricature of an awakened person, all performance and no substance. Jung warned his patients that this trap was inevitable. Everyone who activates these abilities will face the inflation temptation. The test isn't whether you'll feel superior. It's whether you'll recognize that feeling as a warning sign rather than validation. Whether you'll use your gifts to bridge between consciousness and unconsciousness rather than to separate yourself from supposedly lesser beings. The antidote to inflation is brutal honesty about your own shadow, acknowledging that you're capable of every unconscious behavior you judge in others, recognizing that your clarity about others' patterns doesn't mean you've mastered your own, maintaining genuine humility about the mystery of consciousness rather than claiming you've figured it all out. But if you navigate the inflation trap successfully, if you integrate your power without identifying with it, you reach what Jung considered the final form of awakened empathic ability. And this is where the transformation becomes almost frightening in its implications. Because the integrated empath who has navigated inflation doesn't just see clearly. They gain the ability to heal or destroy with a single sentence, to perform what Jung called psychic surgery, the precise application of truth that cuts through years of psychological defense in one moment. Let's examine how this manifests through a story that captures the essential pattern. An empath encounters someone trapped in a destructive pattern. Maybe it's a friend staying in an abusive relationship, making excuse after excuse. Everyone around this friend has tried convincing them to leave. Logical arguments about the partner's behavior, emotional appeals about self-worth, interventions, ultimatums. Nothing penetrates the defense mechanisms protecting the pattern. But the awakened empath doesn't argue, doesn't try to convince, doesn't even offer advice. Instead, she waits, listens, watches. She perceives not just what the friend needs to hear, but the exact psychological moment when they're ready to hear it, when their unconscious defenses are momentarily relaxed, when a crack appears in their protective walls. And in that moment, she speaks one sentence, not harsh, not judgmental, just clear. Maybe something like, "You're staying because leaving would mean admitting you wasted 5 years on someone who never valued you." A single observation that mirrors back exactly what the person needs to see about themselves, and everything shifts. The defense mechanisms crumble. The pattern becomes visible. The person wakes up to their own unconscious behavior. Within a week, they've left the relationship they couldn't leave for years. This is psychic surgery. The ability to deliver truth with such precision, such timing, such care, that it penetrates straight to the core without triggering defensive reactions. It's not about being right or superior. It's about having developed your perception to such a refined degree that you can see not just what someone needs to hear, but exactly when and how they need to hear it. Jung observed that this ability carries massive responsibility, because words delivered with this level of precision are extraordinarily powerful. They can heal decades of trauma in moments. They can also destroy someone's psychological defenses before they're ready to rebuild. The awakened empath becomes a surgeon, working on living psyches. Every word is a scalpel. Every silence is a decision. Every interaction is potentially life-altering. This is why Jung emphasized that the ultimate purpose of empathic abilities isn't power over others. It's individuation, becoming whole yourself, using your perception not to fix everyone around you, but to complete your own psychological development. Because a truly individuated empath uses their gifts sparingly, strategically, only when invited or when someone is genuinely ready to receive truth. The integrated empath becomes what Jung called a bridge between worlds, between conscious and unconscious, between spiritual and physical, between individual and collective. You're not above humanity. You're not separate from the mess. You're deeply human, fully engaged, but operating with a level of awareness that allows you to help others wake up to their own consciousness. And here's the final piece Jung discovered. The integrated empath doesn't just bridge between worlds for others. They become a bridge for collective consciousness evolution. Because every time you navigate your own transformation consciously, you're creating a pathway that makes it easier for others to follow. You're doing the psychological work that benefits the entire species. This is the evolutionary step Jung believed empaths represent. Not the next stage of individual development, but a preview of where human consciousness is heading collectively. You're early adopters of psychological capacities that humanity will eventually need to develop. And your journey from wounded receiver to integrated transmitter is mapping the path others will follow. So here's the question Jung would ask you. Are you ready to stop absorbing and start directing? Are you ready to face the inflation trap and navigate it consciously? Are you ready to become the bridge between unconscious and conscious, using your gifts not for power but for service? This isn't about becoming superhuman. It's about becoming completely human, integrating all aspects of yourself, the sensitive and the strong, the vulnerable and the powerful, the wounded and the wise. The empath who uses their abilities consciously isn't transcending humanity. They're embodying the fullest expression of what human consciousness can become. Your empathic abilities aren't a burden to manage or a curse to endure. They're an invitation to step into the most powerful version of yourself, to become what Jung called the individuated person. Someone who sees clearly, feels deeply, acts consciously, and serves authentically. Someone who has transformed their greatest wound into their greatest gift. Subscribe if you're ready to master your gift. To learn the practices Jung developed for integrating empathic abilities without falling into inflation. To discover how to use your perception as a bridge rather than a weapon. To step fully into the power you've been suppressing your entire life. Because the world doesn't need more empaths hiding their light. It needs more empaths who have learned to direct that light with wisdom, precision, and love. It needs bridges between the conscious and unconscious. And you're here because some part of you knows you're meant to be one of those bridges. This is your evolutionary moment. Your chance to stop playing small and start living as the force of nature you were designed to be. Not better than others. Not separate from humanity, but fully integrated, completely awake, and using every ounce of your extraordinary perception in service of consciousness itself. In the alchemist's path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.